The other thing, saith he, left out, which yet refers to all, the covenanter, is, that he that swears shall by all lawful ways and means, and according to his place and calling, endeavor to perform the covenant. Verse 13, to bring the churches to uniformity and to extirpate heresy. As, for instance, it is the godly magistrate's duty, their place and calling, to send forth ministers to the dark places of the land, and set up lights to guide men's feet into the ways of truth and peace, and reclaim them from errors. And he cannot be urged upon his calling to punish or compel gainsayers. And the minister is to do it in his place by exhorting, rebuking, instructing. But he is to go no further. He is not to deliver men up to judge and be an executioner. Answer. The words, by all lawful means and ways, which this man puts in Italian letters, and says they are left out by the author, whom he refutes, may soon be left out, for they were never in the covenant. The man will defend the covenant, and apparently hath sworn it, but I think he hath scarce read it, for these words are not in the covenant. Let him read again. Turpe est doctori cum culpa redarnit ipsum. Secondly, he swears to bring the churches to nearest uniformity according to his place. But when this man defends the toleration of all the sects in England, Socinians, Arians, Familists, for he, writing anon 1645, when above 20 sundry religions in England came to the streets, he accepts not one in all his treatise, but calls them all the godly party, saints, brethren, the godly, and owns them so in his preface and whole book. He must grant there is no uniformity in faith, discipline, worship by the word of God. For if all these be saints, godly, and holy brethren, they have all one faith, and are saved. But let him tell me by the next, if he can answer, whether there is a nearest or any uniformity in faith, worship, and government between Presbyterians and Socinians, Familists, Antinomians, and Seekers. Yet this man swears to endeavor the nearest conjunction and uniformity amongst all the saints who are to be tolerated. But let him say, if he hath, in this case, ingenuity or learning, what nearest uniformity he knows amongst all these, whether the covenant should not oblige a libertine to endeavor the widest contrariety and deformity of religions amongst these, and to plead for forbearance of them all, as he expoundeth it. Thirdly, but we are, saith he, to endeavor by all lawful means and ways the nearest uniformity among the churches, and the only lawful way, as he thinks, is not by force and by rebuking, instructing, exhorting, and by no weapons, but only by the word of God. But since this author and all the nation of libertines go upon this principle, religion is not to be compelled by force, for we are not infallible, and those whom we force as heretics may be no heretics, for aught we know, but as sound in the faith as ourselves. Then we have no faith, nor any well-grounded persuasion of the word of God, to refute them by the word, and we refute them not of faith, but sinfully and erroneously. For they may be as sound in the faith as we ourselves, for aught we know, and this is a strong argument against moral ways of gaining heretics by the power of the word. For if they may be sound in the faith, and we the heretics, though we refute them by the word, we may be perverting the right ways of God, and fight against Christ as Elymas. For Elymas only by moral ways, not by force or violence, labored to pervert the faith of Sergius Paulus. And it is not apparent that Elymas was persuaded in his conscience that the gospel Paul preached was the truth of God, and so by no means, lawful or unlawful, by force or by the word of God, are we to endeavor uniformity, for our endeavoring is not of faith, nor from the real grounds of the word, but from mere opinions and conjectures. For it may be, say libertines, that all those whom we refute as heretics be sound in the faith, and we, not they, the heretics. And those whom we refute are as much obliged in faith to refute us as we to refute them. So I see not how libertines can use so much as moral compelling of heretics. For first, they cannot compel them with the sword to forsake their heresies, because the sword bearer being fallible, knoweth them not to be heresies. They may be necessary truths for him. Ergo, because the pastor is no more infallible than the magistrate, the pastor with certainty of faith cannot say, Thus saith the Lord, Jezebel is a false prophetess, Hymenaeus and Philetus depart from the faith, and Jezebel. Hymenaeus and Philetus may be sound in the faith, and this pastor who refuteth them, the false heretic. For there is no peremptory and imposing decision of any of these till the last judgment, since now the infallible prophets and apostles are dead. Secondly, upon this ground ye cannot eschew any as a heretic, after twice admonishing him of his heresy. For ye have no faith, nor divine certainty. It is an heresy that ye holdeth. It may be you who admonish him, are the heretic. Only upon opinion you admonish him. Thirdly, you cannot rebuke any heretic sharply, that he may be sound in the faith. For you are not infallible in the bestowing of the lashings of your tongue on the heretic, more than the magistrate in beating him with the sword. And your rebuking of him may be heretical and unjust, and the man sound in the faith. Fourthly, upon the same ground you cannot admonish and instruct him in faith, nor, fifthly, call the opinion of the magistrates coercing of men with the sword for their conscience a bloody tenant and persecution of the saints, nor, sixthly, can you in faith refuse him lodging in your house, and all you. Seventhly, saying in the pulpit, such a way of familism is a way of heresy, is not resolved in, thus saith the Lord, by such a preacher, but such a preacher so thinketh, possibly fancies, that the Lord saith such a way is heresy. And by the same reason, whatever pastors preach, especially except it be 2 or 3 fundamentals which all Christians, Papists, Socinians, Lutherans, Protestants, Familists, Arminians, Seekers, etc., is but the dictates of their own conscience, and so they preach, so they believe, and so they profess not, because God so saith, but because their conscience so dictates to them. And here is the libertine's creed. Methinks Christ died for sinners, the dead shall be raised, etc. And so libertines are very papists in this, and resolve our faith into the testimony of men, the conjectures of the conscience. So he goes on. He expounds uniformity and nearest conjunction to be absolute conjunction and identity, if we be agreed of the same church officers with the reformed churches, and have cast out the old usurpers, cashiered the common prayer book, ceremonies, altars, crucifixes, all which we have done by the covenant. Do we not save our covenant, though we cast not our churches into such classical, provincial, or national forms? Answer. Nor do we plead for absolute identity in doctrine and worship, but endeavor it we ought. But how I pray you doth the magistrate, for that I had almost forgot, send ministers to rebuke, exhort, and reclaim men from their errors, but not compel gainsayers. The magistrate, I am sure, sent not Paul and Barnabas. It was not so from the beginning. In the apostolic church there were no parliament ministers. But it may be the author means a political civil sending of ministers to extirpate heretics. But be it so. All magistratical sending of magistrates is a commanding of them by the sword in a compulsive way, that they go preach against familism, Socinianism, Arianism. But if so, good sir, remember yourself, the magistrate, as the magistrate doth not request, and morally by the power of the word, for he hath not any such spiritual armor, I conceive for his warfare. Entreat and say, good pastors, I beseech you go preach against Dell, Randall, Saltmarsh, and other familists, and extirpate their heresies. Private men so send pastors, but as a magistrate he must say, I command you go preach against these heresies, under the pain of bearing the vengeance of my sword. Now, if the pastors reply, good master judge, we cannot do that, for we think familism a new, glorious discovery of spirit, and Mr. Saltmarsh hath beaten out of the Scriptures new sparkles of glory and flowings of free grace. Familism is no heresy. If the magistrate, notwithstanding by his place and calling, send these and command them to go and extirpate familism, doth he not compel the consciences of these pastors he sends? What do ye then talk of no compelling? For whatever the magistrate by his place doth command, which is lawful, if the ministers or any other refuse to obey, he may use the sword against them. Ye cannot say, if it be a matter of conscience, ye cannot compel them to do it by his place. Then, say I, by his place he cannot command them neither. Beside that, the answer is directly against the words of the covenant, if every man in like manner, Article 2, be to endeavor the extirpation of popery, prelacy, heresy, and schism, in his several places and callings, as the author saith. This refers to the whole obligation of each person respectively. Then is the magistrate, according to his place and calling, which is to bear the sword, to compel with the sword the extirpation of popery and prelacy, heresy and schism. And what hath the author gained by his gloss, which I conceive is the true gloss, except he mean the fall to prayers, requests, obtestations, that heretics would lay aside their errors and preach sound doctrine? But now he doth so say in request, not according to his place as a magistrate, but according to his vocation as a saint and a Christian, which yet crosses the covenant, and makes the Parliament, not as the supreme court of judges, to take the covenant, but as so many private Christians. Secondly, if so, the judges are not in their respective places to take the covenant, nor endeavor the extirpation of heresy, because that is against the word of God. But then by what authority or calling did the Parliament cast out old usurpers and prelates, cashier the service book, ceremonies, altars, and crucifixes? Either as a Parliament, and so by the sword. Is not here yet the prelate's conscience squeezed to the blood? Is not here highest violence done to the consciences of high altarmen and adorers of crucifixes? Why to them more than to familists? But if this was done by request, the words of butter and oil from the Parliament and committeemen, then are ordinances of Parliament but mere requests to the subjects. But it is protestatio contrarii facto. He addeth, if these words, we shall endeavor the extirpation of schism, and whatsoever shall be found contrary to sound doctrine, etc., be levelled only against the congregation men, it was not fair to draw them into a covenant to destroy themselves. It is disservice to the state, to spoil the state of so many godly and brave men, and seems to be but the birth of that challenge against these men, to be the Sanballats and Tobias of this present work, and is the highest breach of love. Answer. It is apparent the congregational men he meaneth are independents, who would have their churches gathered out of true churches, who will not be called schismatics, as if Ensis and Gladius were not one thing. Then this author levelleth these words against Presbyterians as the schismatics. For wherever one church is rent from another true church, one of the two is the schismatic church. Sure, but the author will not have independents, the schismatics. Then was it fair to level these words in the covenant against Presbyterians, and draw them in a covenant to destroy both their soul and body? Number 2, the congregational men were not drawn, but they came to another religion with fair words to draw Presbyterians in a covenant, and said and swore to endeavor uniformity, and yet practice this day multiformity of religions, and have put to the sale the blood of many gallant men in Scotland, that so they may buy with their lives cursed liberty of conscience. But will it not be bitterness in the end? Number 3, the author hints at a story that fell out in the assembly of divines, where I was witness. Mr. Philip Nye, having sworn to endeavor the preservation of Presbyterian government in the covenant, was pleased in the face of the assembly and the hearing of that renowned general of England, for the time, the Earl of Essex, and many other honourable and noble persons, to declaim against Presbyterial government, as formidable to states and free kingdoms, as of old some called Jerusalem the rebellious city, and the prelates the same way burdened the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. But Mr. Alexander Henderson, a man for piety, learning, prudency, and singular moderation, from zeal, not from the spirit of gall and wormwood, as the author slanderously speaketh, said they were the words of Tobiah and Sanballat, to hinder the work of reformation. Now whether that worthy man spake what hath now come to pass, let the godly divines of the assembly be judge.